going. All right, welcome back into the podcast. Excited for this guest. We did this last year, and he and I talked plenty off screen, talking football history, NFL history, Bears history. And we got to do some Hall of Fame. I did it a little bit with Ron Rivera a couple weeks ago. I highly recommend, if you're a history guy, to go check out Ron's thoughts, because Ron Rivera played with Steve McMichael, was the defensive coordinator with Devin Hester, and was the head coach in Carolina with Julius Peppers, the three Chicago Bears that are up for the Hall of Fame this year. But to get a little bit more in depth with them, we're going to talk to Jack Silverstein. I'm sure most of you follow him already. It's at Read Jack on the Twixter machine. He's also got a 1990s Bulls newsletter, readjack.substack.com. And that is, you can get that, you can subscribe for the low cost of a Scottie Pippen a year or a John Paxson a month. And Jack joins me now. Jack, Bill Zimmerman, how you doing?
Hey, I'm well, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing very good. I'm excited because not only can we talk some Hall of Fame here, usually with the Bears, there's one guy up there, maybe two. We've actually got three guys. I know Julius Peppers didn't have a long Bears career, but he was here. He did have some impactful seasons. But I want to go back in the time machine a little bit and start with Steve McMichael, because I know he's a guy that you were fighting for years to try and get attention to him in the senior committee with some of the impact he had on that 85 Bears. And he was, I think for Chicagoans, he was a big face of that team because he was Mongo and he had the big personality and he was doing local media. But from a national perspective, I think Dent got the you heard about Richard Dent, you heard about Mike Singletary. They were getting the headlines. Dan Hampton, some. Even they're not Hall of Fame caliber guys, but Otis Wilson and Wilbur Marshall were flashy guys. McMichael, you didn't hear as much about Steve McMichael, and that was, I think, a shame from a national perspective. So what was it about Steve McMichael for you where you really were just like, the committee is missing the boat on him? He is not getting enough attention.
So I was behind on McMichael. I think the guys who hit me more to McMichael were our colleague Lester Wilfong, ECW. Maybe Jeff Burkus and Rick Tellender. I think those guys, for me, were way ahead of me. And now Mongo's greatness came up when we did our top 100 Bears list. And we did one at Windy City Gridiron, the Tribune did one, and the Bears did one. And all three of those had McMichael as the number 4 defensive lineman in Bears history, behind Atkins, Hampton, and Dent, and all in the top 25 of Bears. So I don't remember where I put him. I was behind because I think growing up, I was always thinking a lot more about his personality, his persona, and I was thinking probably more about Dent, Hamp, Singletary, Wilbur Marshall. I was a big Dave Duerson guy, so I was off a little bit on Mongo, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago where Tellender had written a column in favor of him. I think Lester maybe had gone to bat for him, and so I started looking at his numbers and I started digging into his case and saying, okay, now there's a lot of conversation about Mongo, and what does it look like to me? So I started digging into his case, and I was blown away. I mean, the big number that jumped out at me was that over an 11-year period, the bulk of his career, Steve McMichael averaged more sacks than all of the defensive tackles on the AP All-Pro team. So if you take all the defensive tackles, and look, some of them are nose tackles. They're not going to be big sack guys, but some of them were absolutely pass rushers. And I'm saying, in his time, I think it was from 84 to 93, I think was the timeline. And it was amazing. I mean, he out-sacked the entire all-pro defensive tackles and guys who were beating him out for defensive tackle. It was also weird that there were 3 seasons where he was double digits in sacks and was not named all-pro. And I don't know if that was maybe a feeling that, well, that's not a job of a defensive tackle. I don't know. But like when we look at it now, we're just like, he had these massive seasons. He had all these seasons with 8 or more sacks. And I think 8 is a real good number where, yeah, there might be reasons why you have fewer as an interior defensive lineman. But then we've seen guys like John Randall and Aaron Donald who are explosive up the middle and are having huge sack numbers, 12, 13, 15. So 8 to me is a good number, and he was consistently hitting 8 sacks. So I looked at that and I put a piece together, and it kind of just grew from there, where I was just realizing, boy, his case is a lot better. And I wanted to be on board just for football reasons, because it had definitely, his case had cropped up because of ALS, and that brought an urgency to it and brought a new attention to it. But, I wanted to just see what it looked like on football reasons. And here are the numbers from 83 until so 83 to 93. So the first season McMichael was a starter until his final season with the Bears. The average Associated Press All-Pro defensive tackle had 7.8 sacks per year, and McMichael had 8.2 sacks per year. He's also tied for third in NFL history for the most 8-sack seasons for a defensive tackle. It's Alan Page had 11, Alex Karras had 8, and then Randall and Steve McMichael had 7. You start looking at his numbers like that, and 95 sacks as a defensive tackle, and always as a defensive tackle. I mean, Hampton was outside and inside, famously inside first, then moved outside. Dent pretty much was outside. You've got other guys like Reggie White was a defensive end who played some tackle. J.J. Watt was a defensive end who played some tackle. But Steve McMichael, 95 sacks from the middle of a defense. That really changed the way that I looked at him. That opened my eyes to the rest of his case. And it, I just kept digging, and obviously the voters felt the same way, and here we are.
Yeah, and I do wonder, and I don't know this for certain because I was a kid in the 1980s and I enjoyed McMichael and watched McMichael, but in terms of really knowing football, in terms of what analysts were looking at and teams were looking at, but we talk about so much in today's game about the interior pressure and collapsing the pocket and how important that was. And Ron Rivera brought it up in my interview about how good he was at collapsing the pocket, keeping quarterbacks further back and giving Dent and Hampton on the outside lanes to get to the quarterback, and how important McMichael was for that. And yet he was still able to get home on his own and get those sacks. And I do wonder if maybe that wasn't the same thought process as it was. And the other detractors you heard about McMichael was, well, he's with Dent and Hampton and Singletary, so he wasn't a focal point. But I sit there and go, Deacon Jones and, Merlin Olsen on the fearsome foursome. We don't take away from Deacon Jones because Merlin Olsen was on the other side. We don't take away from Alan Page, Carl Eller, Jim Marshall, because they all got to play together with the Purple People Eaters. If you're among greatness, you're among greatness. That shouldn't be a detraction for it. And when you just look at what McMichael, not just what he was able to accomplish for a few years, but the longevity, like you're talking about 10, 11-year stretches where this guy's averaging over 8 sacks a game from the interior. I mean, this is a case that definitely fell through the cracks and got pushed aside. And, unfortunately, maybe it was ALS that kind of brought up his case again. And, it's amazing that Steve's such a fighter that he's still here today with us and on the cusp of hearing his name for the Hall of Fame. But this is a case that stands on its own. This is not let's do this for Mongo because he has ALS. This is a case of a guy who deserves to be in the Hall of Fame and just took way too long to get the recognition.
Yeah, well, this brings up an issue that I've talked about, and that I'm not alone in this, that a lot of people talked about, which is the challenge of getting names into the room.
Right.
When you can't get people into the room to be discussed, you're always going to leave people behind. It's not just McMichael. Art Powell was never a finalist as a modern era candidate. He's now about to go into Canton. Joe Klecko was never a finalist. He was elected as a senior last year. Ken Riley was never a finalist. He was elected as a senior last year. So we see it a lot. And there are people right now, Richmond Webb has never been a semifinalist, much less a finalist.
I heard you mention that on CGO. I did not realize that. And that's remarkable. He was just a dominant offensive lineman. He was the best at his position.
He defined the position.
Yeah.
He's never been there. Sterling Sharp, who was the clear-cut second best wide receiver of his time behind Jerry Rice, he was never there. Now he had a shorter,
but if you're going to put Terrell
career.
Davis and Gale Sayers in, you've got to look at Sterling Sharp.
Sure, there are a number of other players. We just passed Tim McDonald over. Tim McDonald, safety for the Cardinals and the 49ers. He checks all the boxes. He won a ring. He was a multi-time All-Pro. He had more All-Pro selections with the NEA, which is the players' choices. He, like I said, won a championship, could do everything. His stats are above recent safeties who have gotten John Lynch, Steve Atwater. So where's Tim McDonald? Well, now he's off to the senior pool. Leslie O'Neal, who had a great career. Is he a Hall of Famer? He should be debated. And that's what happens. That's what happened now with Steve McMichael. And there are people who look at this. What I don't want to happen with Steve McMichael is for people to say, oh, well, this is just ALS. This is just a mercy vote. I understand the frustration of fans of Lester Hayes, Elsie Greenwood, Bob Kuchenberg, for a long time Randy Gradishar, for a long time Chuck Howley. Great players who either were ignored for a long time or were finalists for many years and never elected. And now it's like, well, Steve McMichael just pops up out of nowhere. Yes, but that is partially the result of never being in the room in the first place. So when you're stuck on all these seniors, you can't figure out a way to explain their case in new terms. What more can you say about Lester Hayes? Like, he's either in or he's not. What more can you say about Bob Kuchenberg? He's either in or he's not. Well, here comes Steve McMichael and Art Powell. Their cases have never been heard. And that's working in their favor now, because now their cases are fresh and voters say, oh, you know what? Wow, I didn't know that Steve McMichael outsacked the AP defensive tackles of his era. Never mind. Maybe I should be looking over here. So it's definitely something that I think that the Hall needs to find a way to figure it out. And to me, and it's other people have brought it up. Ira Kaufman's brought it up. Clark Judge has brought it up. Rick Gosselin's brought it up. The way to do that is to have a non-voting meeting. Untether the act of a formal discussion from the label of finalist. Because when you only discuss people once they're called finalists, then you run the risk of insulting them. Well, they were a finalist and now they've dropped out. But that's what you should be doing. You should be evaluating people without the concern of, well, we labeled you a finalist and now everybody in the media and all the fans know you were a finalist, but now you're not good enough. And now that's a complaint. Get more people in the room, have a non-voting meeting in June, July. I mean, find a way to make it happen. There's been complaints from voters. Well, we can't discuss everyone. There were 173 modern era nominees. Yeah, but look at that list. You don't need to discuss all those people.
Right.
Like, voters know why that list was so big, and they know that some of those people are not legitimate possible Hall of Famers.
Yeah, there's 100 people you can eliminate in a 30-second
in 30 seconds. So to sit here and say, oh, well, we can't meet because there's too many names. Come on, man. Come on. You cover football for your entire life. You cover football right now. You can't look at that list and figure out who needs to be discussed and who doesn't. Come on. That's ridiculous.
I completely agree. They could definitely have a better approach to seniors and hopefully.
And they're improving it, and I appreciate that. But there are some, I think, real basic, obvious fixes where you need no process that leaves Richmond Webb out of the conversation now for 17 years, going on 18, soon to be 20. That's a failed process.
Yeah. If he's not part of the conversation, I agree. Then there's something wrong with how you're getting to your solution. So let's move on to Julius Peppers. I don't want to spend too much time on him. I want to spend more time on Devin Hester. But Julius Peppers, and the one thing I tell people, if you want to truly appreciate Julius Peppers, if you're 21, 22 years old, so you were a kid, you don't really remember Peppers that well, peak Julius Peppers, because I think he's underappreciated. I think he's first ballot Hall of Famer. But I think he's actually underappreciated with how good he was, because I don't hear people talking about him, I think, the way they should. But if you can find old North Carolina basketball games, Julius Peppers played it, that helps you understand how gifted of an athlete this guy was. He was 280 pounds and playing 2 feet above the rim. Like, he was a remarkable athlete, and it translated to the football field. And because of that, what he was able to do on the field was so unique compared to any of his peers.
Yeah, I think one mark of a Hall of Famer is how long can you make their case without mentioning any numbers?
I
And
like
you can and you can make Julius Peppers' case for a long time just describing what you saw. The speed off the edge mixed with the size. He could play inside, he could play outside, and he did both. Then he went to Green Bay in a 3-4, and now he's lining up off the line as an outside linebacker. So he's a defensive end, he's a defensive tackle, he's an outside linebacker. Obviously, he's got the sacks, but what I think about are the big plays, the athleticism to. I mean, I remember he had one play. I think it was 2010 because I think it was his first year on the Bears. We played Carolina that year, and he had a play where it was the type of play you saw Urlacher make, but Urlacher's already running around in space. Peppers is on, got one hand on the turf. There's a pass. He reached up, he batted the ball up, and then it went behind him, and he turned and then dove and made the interception. I mean, any other player, how many other defensive ends bat that ball? Not many. How many actually then have a chance at the interception? Fewer still. How many make the interception and finish the play? Not, Peppers.
You can count them on one hand, maybe one finger.
Maybe one finger, right. Peppers, I would say J.J. Watt. That's a J.J. Watt play. Not many. Then I think about the speed that he had. I think about the play he made in 2013 against the Steelers, running back. It was either a real short interception or it was a fumble near the line. But the speed that he had to run those back, some of the speed plays.
He had defensive back speed.
He had defensive back speed. I mean, I'm looking at his Pro Football Reference, and like his rookie year, his long takeaway was 21 yards. His third year, his long was 97 yards on an interception, 60 yards on a fumble return. Then you go down to 2014. Now he's 34 with the Packers. He had a 52-yard interception return, but he only had 2 interceptions that year. He ran it back 101 yards. So the other one was a beast too. He scored on both. Then you look at he had 12 sacks his rookie year. He had 11 sacks his second to last year. I mean, you cut these numbers anyway. 18 tackles for loss in 2006, 14 and a half sacks in 2008. It's just any way that you look at these numbers, you don't even have to go to the career numbers as great as they are. But I mean, you got Jared Allen right now as a finalist. Jared Allen's a hell of a player. Julius Peppers had almost 20 more sacks than Jared Allen. I mean, you look at the forced fumbles. He had at least one forced fumble every year of his career. He had 5 in 1, 2, 3 seasons. He had 4 in 2004. Again, look at what he was doing in 2014 with the Packers. And remember how close they came. I remember looking at him at the end of that NFC Championship game when Green Bay disintegrated. And not for anything that Peppers was doing wrong. And I just remember thinking man, this guy, of all these guys, this guy, even as a Packer, boy, he belonged back in a Super Bowl. He belonged having another shot at a ring. Just that was a shame. But I mean, you look at 2014 at 34 years old, 16 starts, 2 interceptions, returned for 101 yards. Both were touchdowns, 4 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 17 quarterback hits. I mean,
incredible,
ridiculous. And again, and he's doing that in a new position technically because he's doing that in a 3-4. So you can talk about Julius Peppers for a long time before you get to career numbers, and that is a huge distinguishing factor for me, especially on this ballot where a lot of what some of these wide receivers bring to the table is their career numbers. A lot of what some of these Jared Allen is a lot about career numbers. Jared Allen, to me, was the second best defensive lineman on the Vikings after Kevin Williams, who, by the way, also has not been a semifinalist yet. So Jared Allen he's a Hall of Famer for sure, but you have to really get into his career numbers to make the case. You can just make the case on Julius Peppers with the things you remember, the things that watching him, how you felt. And that's something special. So I'll be excited Jared Allen, by the way, another ex-Bear, so give us 4.
That's true. That's true. Jared Allen did have a cup of coffee over here. All right. Well, I know I could talk to you for 90 minutes, but we're trying and keep this to a reasonable time here. So let's move on. Let's move over to Devin Hester. And I think this is the guy that Bears fans love to talk about the most. Not that they don't love McMichael or Peppers, but Hester was so explosive and so exciting. And the idea of a return specialist being a Hall of Famer did not exist before Devin Hester came into the league. They would just, and not that guys like Brian Mitchell and got, Mel Gray and White Shoes Johnson and these great returners. Not that they weren't great, but it was just, they're a returner. And they were just pushed aside immediately. There wasn't even a thought. It's like punting. And Ray Guy finally got recognition, quite a few years ago. But this idea didn't exist. And then we started looking at Devin Hester and going, but he impacts a game so much. And I like what Ron Rivera told me about Devin Hester is, and not that we can quantify this. I mean, I'm sure you could if someone went through and looked at everything, but the amount of points per touch that Devin Hester had compared to, a guy like Jerry Rice that's got, obscene numbers and is probably the GOAT of any football player of all time. But, Jerry Rice had so many opportunities, and Hester's opportunities were so limited in the return game, and he still just explosive plays. And even if he didn't score, got the offense basically in field goal range to start on so many occasions that a Rex Grossman offense desperately needed in those years of that Lovie Smith team. So The amount of impact he had on the game and the amount of fear that he put in opposing coaches. I mean, the Tony Dungy comments he's made about the Super Bowl, you could talk about forever.
Right.
But what his impact on the game is undeniable. And he is, it's fine that he wasn't a first ballot Hall of Famer, but I don't want Devin Hester to wait any longer because there's a lot of names coming down the pipeline that could make it more difficult. I'm really hoping this is the year Devin Hester gets his name heard. Yeah,
I think that you put it perfectly, Bill. And again, Devin Hester is someone who you can explain his greatness before you get to any numbers. And his numbers are otherworldly. But I wrote a piece for Windy City Gridiron called The Impossible Task of Kicking. I think it was called The Impossible Task of Kicking Away from Devin Hester. And it just looked at 4 ways that Devin Hester impacted games when the ball was not in his hands. You had teams kicking out of bounds on kickoffs.
On kickoffs, absolutely.
The Dallas Cowboys, Week 3, 2007, Hester's second season, they kicked the opening kickoff out of bounds, and John Madden and Al Michaels on the broadcast compliment the coaching decision.
Take it at the 40.
You had Rod Marinelli telling his players when he was the coach of the Lions, punt it into Lake Michigan. You had players doing all sorts of tricky things, and then the Bears would do their own. Dave Tobe would do his own tricky things where he'd put Rasheed Davis high, and you had plays where, Rasheed Davis, who was a hell of a kick returner himself, he gets the ball as the up man, and it's a short, I'm putting that in quotes, short return, 19 yards, and it's at midfield. Devin Hester didn't touch the ball in that play. No player in the return game was able to have that impact where he didn't even need the ball in his hands. In 2012, Devin Hester didn't have a return touchdown, and late into December, I haven't checked the final stat, but late into December, the Bears were still leading the NFL in average starting field position. And Devin didn't have a touchdown. Now, that Bears defense was also getting a lot of takeaways, but all the touchdowns that they got, those don't count towards field position because there's no field position there. So, I mean, a lot of it was what we could do in the return game and what Devin could do. A lot of people like to say that, well, they changed the rules because of Hester. So that actually isn't true. The kickoff rule wasn't changed because of Hester. And remember, he wasn't even returning kicks at that point because they had given it to Danielle Manning. But in all the original reporting, when they made that kickoff change, the number one name that came up from reporters and from players and coaches was Devin Hester, even though he wasn't even the Bears' full-time kick returner at that point. He was just so dangerous. I look at Devin Hester and I see that combination of kick and punt, which Brian Mitchell has talked about. Brian Mitchell said, these are 2 different jobs. And, a kick returner has just got to be sturdy speed, breakaway speed, but sturdiness. And a punt returner has to be vision and shiftiness, and I mean, really those two things. And that's why you see that disparity in a lot of stats. Rick Upchurch, 8 punt return touchdowns in his career, 0 kick return touchdowns. Leon Washington, 8 kick return touchdowns in his career, 0 punt return touchdowns. Cordero Patterson, the all-time leader in kick return touchdowns with 9.
Can't return punts.
He has fewer punt return yards than Devin Hester has punt return touchdowns. So Devin Hester changes individual games. He changed the way that teams coached. He changed the way that teams drafted. You look at Super Bowl 41. That is a game with a first ballot Hall of Fame middle linebacker at his peak. That is a game with a perennial Pro Bowl outside linebacker at his peak. That is a game with Thomas Jones, the first Bears running back at the time to rush for 1,300 yards other than Walter Payton. That is a game with a quarterback who had his difficulties, to say the least. And the one guy who they focused on to take out of the game was Devin Hester. Now you look at Desmond Howard. Desmond Howard in 1996 had one of the great return seasons of all time. He led the NFL in punt return yards, punt returns, punt return average, and punt return touchdowns. He also had a punt return touchdown in the playoffs, and he had been killing the Patriots in that Super Bowl.
Right.
And they score in the third quarter to get it to 6 points. And what do? They kick straight down the middle to Desmond Howard. They didn't take him out of the game.
Yeah,
they didn't. They didn't think, oh, maybe we shouldn't kick it to this guy who's been killing people. Interesting note about that Desmond Howard kick return touchdown. That is the only kick return touchdown of Desmond Howard's career.
I didn't realize that.
So the number of players who can actually do both: Mel Gray, Brian Mitchell, Dante Hall, Gale Sayers, Deion Sanders, Devin Hester. It's not a lot. Josh Cribbs, I'll give him due, but there are a lot of guys who were making all-decade or making all-pro because they could do one or the other. And Devin did it both, and Devin did it all the way from his rookie year to his final game. His first game of his career, scores his first career touchdown on a return against the Packers. His last game of his career, he set his personal best, his career high in kick return yards with 194. I think it was his postseason high. And there was an 80-yard punt return that was called back on a hold, which would have given Devin Hester the NFL record for most return yards in a playoff game. He did it in his final game. He did it with Seattle.
Right.
His kick return yardage in that game was more than the career high of playoff kick return yardage for the last 5 players who had been named all-decade kick returner first team.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable, and you do a great job of putting the numbers in perspective. And the one thing that I hear people bring up, and I hate it, and I'm going to use baseball as a comparison, is, well, Devin Hester couldn't do anything else. Well, first of all, if that's all he was ever asked to do, that's all that matters. But, they wanted him to play cornerback, and he couldn't play cornerback. And then they tried him at receiver, and he wasn't that good at receiver. Well, when I look at baseball, Mariano Rivera was a failed starter, and then became a closer and became the greatest closer of all time.
Totally.
Further, like Tim Wakefield was a failed, and I don't think he's a Hall of Famer, but Tim Wakefield was a failed shortstop and then mastered the knuckleball and had a 20-year career as a pitcher. Dale Murphy was a failed catcher, and they moved him to right field. You go on and on about guys that failed at positions, found their way in a different way in their sport, and had great success. So I don't care if Devin Hester couldn't play cornerback at the NFL level, when what he could do in a return game was so unique that he is literally the only one that has done it at that level. And I understand Brian Mitchell and some of these other guys, but no one had an impact and no one could scare teams like Devin.
Yeah, and the fear factor there is so important. I mean, people were game planning for a returner, and fans were planning their bathroom breaks around a returner. And people like to talk about snap counts, and that was actually we know from Dan Pompei last year that was where the conversation broke down in Hester's second year. Was there was all this pushback on snap counts. Well, if you look at the percentage of yards versus the percentage of touches that Devin had compared to his offensive teammates, it was monumental. And yeah, people will say, well, of course. I mean, returners, they're always going to average, they're going to average like 20 yards on a kick return, and maybe a bad punt returner is maybe going to average 8 yards on a punt return, and no running back is going to average 8 yards a carry. But like, okay, so why are we just dismissing that? Why are we dismissing the ability of a great returner to give you, instead of a fifth of the field, a quarter of the field? Why are we dismissing the impact of a great returner to give you 12, 13 yards on a punt return and flip the field and get you close to field goal range? This is 2006, a year, obviously we went to the Super Bowl, and obviously we had some offensive challenges, and we needed every single yard. Devin Hester did not touch the ball on defense or offense in 2006, only on returns. Thomas Jones had 35% of our touches. Devin Hester had 7% of our touches. Thomas Jones had led the team with 17.5% of our yards. Devin Hester was second with 15.9% of our yards.
That's crazy.
Then you fast forward to 2013, when Devin Hester again went back to he didn't have any snaps on offense. He didn't obviously have any snaps on defense. And let's see, where is it? That year obviously was a huge Matt Forte year. Matt Forte had, 39%. No, wait, hold on. Sorry, I want to get this because this is good.
All right.
Let's see. Here it is. Matt Forte had 36% of the touches. Oh, this is over 08 to 13. So when they were teammates, Matt Forte had 36% of the Bears' touches and 21% of the yards. Devin Hester had 10.6% of the touches and 19% of the yards.
Wow.
So he was right behind Forte, and he was ahead of Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey in 2013. I'm losing it now, where exactly it is. But the percentage of yardage and the fact that, you can take the ball out of his hands by punting out of bounds. You can take the ball out of his hands by kicking it short. But when he actually has the ball in his hands, the yardage that he's gaining was massive. So the fact that he's gotten this far is already amazing. He needs to go in. I'm hoping that voters put him in. I agree. I think he could have been a first ballot Hall of Famer, but really because of that ballot, the year he was first ballot, it was that class was Baselli, Leroy Butler, Richard Seymour, Sam Mills, and Bryant Young. So no one who sniffed a first or second ballot induction. Sam Mills was on his 20th year. In that type of year, I think you could have justified Devin going in a year like the other, like when there was Peyton and Charles Woodson and Calvin Johnson all in the same year as first ballot. No, then you don't.
I was thinking that was his first year. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, all right. You're not going to put a returner in first ballot versus a first ballot every down player who was the best of the best of the best. But right now we're looking at wide receivers who are the 6th, 7th, 8th best of their era. We're looking at defensive ends who are the 3rd, 4th, 5th best of their era. We're looking at Devin Hester, who is the undisputed greatest ever at a position that is older than the NFL.
Yeah, that's true.
And the people who are and the people who support him most are the other people who have already lost out on the respect and ability to go to Canton. Dante Hall, Mel Gray, Brian Mitchell, Gale Sayers before he passed away said that Devin Hester belonged. Deion Sanders has said that Devin Hester is the greatest ever. So that the people who are most in his corner are potentially the ones with the most to lose because they're getting ignored because they're just returners. So it's got to be Devin this year. As I wrote a few years ago, Devin is a lock based on historical trends to get in by 2027 because all first ballot finalists have gotten in within 6 years in the semifinal era. But it needs to be sooner. It needs to be this year. And if it turns out that it's not this year, it needs to be next year. I don't care who's coming on the ballot. It is time. Devin Hester.
All right. Last thing for you, and then I'll let you go. Let's do a little prediction here. I think we both agree Steve McMichael's the rubber stamp. He is in.
The seniors are in.
Yeah,
the seniors are in, and Buddy Parker as the coach, he's in. These guys are all in because if they voted against them, it is a huge problem for their process. It's going to lead to infighting and all sorts of questions about the seniors are in, and Buddy Parker is in.
So McMichael's going to be in. Julius Peppers, it's almost impossible to imagine him not being a first ballot Hall of Famer
I'd
in
be
my
stunned
eyes.
if Julius Peppers wasn't.
So let me get you this then. Final prediction: Devin Hester. I know you say you want him in this year. Do you think Devin Hester is in the Hall of Fame this year?
I suspect he's not for a few reasons. Number one, last year they were still debating snap counts. Snap counts is the lowest possible bar for a returner. It's pretty silly. So if you're still debating snap counts in year two, I feel like you might need another year or two to push that vending machine over. You know, like
I get you.
that might be tricky. You know, Pepper. I'm pretty confident Peppers is going in. They're gonna elect at least one wide receiver. They're gonna lean heavily probably on Gates. So that's 3. They could go back to and get a second wide receiver, or they could get a second wide receiver, leave Gates a year. But they just elevated Jared Allen last year over Hester. Patrick Willis has been waiting for a really long time now. You could have some wild cards. Eric Allen was in his first time as a finalist. Now Darren Woodson is getting a little long in the tooth as a finalist, as a modern era guy. The one thing that Hester has against him is also what he has going for him, which is that he's the only specialist. So he doesn't have to. You don't have to like knock anybody out. You don't have to like debate like him versus Mel Gray or Brian Mitchell. And he's the only full-time Bear. Or is there going to be some sort of backlash because they go, all right, well, Mongo's in. But we've seen them. They like to pair, they paired up Klecko and Revis. They paired up Ware and Howley. So I don't know. I don't know how you handicap that. My guess, if I had to guess, would be that he's not in. And my guess on the class would be Peppers, Andre Johnson, Antonio Gates, Jared Allen, and Patrick Willis. But Devin would be right there as a wild card. He could definitely get in. And I know that Dan went super hard and made a great case for him, as he does all of our Bears. So if I had to guess, I would bet that Devin's got one more year. That would be my guess.
All right. Well, I hope you're wrong, as all Bears fans do, because we'd love to see Devin get his name called and get that bust in Canton. So there he is, at Reed Jack on Twitter, the best Chicago sports historian you'll find. And make sure you subscribe to that 90s Bulls newsletter, readjack.substack.com. Jack, Thanks for so much time. Really appreciate it. And we will be finding out here in just a few days who that class is.
February 8th, we find out if things don't leak sooner. But, they've done, even though they extended this, so they used to vote the day before the Super Bowl, and so there was much less chance of a leak. Now they've got it weeks out, and they've done a pretty good job of containing leaks, so that's been impressive. My 90s Bulls newsletter is driving toward my 90s Bulls book, 6 Rings. It'll be the first comprehensive book on the 90s Bulls. Incredibly, no such book exists. This will be the first.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
That'll be a must read. Jack, thanks so much.
Thanks, Bill.